He wasn't supposed to die that day. It was meant to be a standard procedure, quick in, quick out, and Chuck Podhast, the man who kept one of reality TV's most dysfunctional families semi-functional, would be back on his feet in a few weeks. But within hours, that plan unraveled. Internal bleeding, collapsed tissue walls, an 8-hour emergency battle that none of the cameras caught and even TLC didn't prepare for. By morning, Chuck was still breathing. But something had changed. Permanently. This is the goodbye that never aired. Welcome to TLC Drama Files. I'm Aliva, and this one's different. If you're watching this with your heart half in your throat already, you're not alone. Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment, because yes, we're going there. Not the tweet, not the tribute, the real goodbye. The moment Chuck's family stood around his hospital bed, hands shaking, mouths silent, unable to do anything but hope he'd squeeze back one more time. And he did. Once. Because that's who Chuck was. Holding everyone up, even at the end, even when everything else was falling. You didn't see Libby's face that morning. You saw the post later, soft-toned, polished, respectful. But you didn't see Elizabeth Castrovet, sitting in that ICU chair, whispering to her dad about how her daughter's drawings were hanging on the fridge. How the boat trips he barely made it to had become her life's golden scenes. She was holding his hand while everyone else was holding each other. She was the last one to leave his side. And TLC? Silent, cold. For a network that built a franchise off messy family drama, the one universal storyline, death, got cut out clean. So why was this tragedy brushed under the rug? According to close friends and crew, Chuck's health had been declining for a while. Glioblastoma isn't gentle. It doesn't wait for camera setups or season breaks. It takes pieces of people before the doctors can explain what's happening. By 2025, his body had already endured months of radiation, chemo, and fatigue that slowly started stealing his sharpness. But as long as there were birthday cakes or backyard barbecues, he showed up. Cancer took the strength. He refused to give up the role. The surgery that took everything from him wasn't cancer-related. It was hernia repair. The kind of routine issue that happens after too many invasive treatments tear through your body's reserves. What happens next still shakes those who were inside that hospital. The operating team couldn't stop the bleeding fast enough. The damage wasn't visible on scans, but it was deep. Tissue weakened by months of medication collapsed. There were moments, harsh, quiet, clinical, where the room stopped moving, and the surgeons didn't speak. And in the waiting room, the family was back in fight or flight. By the time Libby heard he'd survived the surgery itself, the celebration was already muted. Survival wasn't the same as recovery. She posted 2 weeks later. Tragedy struck our family. She didn't name the hospital. She didn't share any photos, not even a candle. Just a quiet line about her father ascending to heaven and a sentence that twisted in every parent's gut. We're trying to figure out how to live without him. And still, TLC said nothing. No footage, no tribute, no sit-down special, nothing. What was so raw, so real, so emotionally volatile that the network didn't even try to turn it into content. Because here's the part fans weren't supposed to piece together. Chuck's death didn't just break Libby. It broke the balance. Behind the scenes, producers reportedly were already tightening protocols. Several staff members had already flagged rising volatility. Andre's temper, Libby's silence, suspicion ran heavy through production calls, as if everyone knew something was coming and didn't know how ugly it might get. And when Chuck passed, producers started acting like a crisis team. No big camera send-off, no cast interviews about the loss, no supportive in memoriam episode. They shut it down. Quietly. What footage did TLC intentionally hold back? And why did Chuck's goodbye feel more like a cover-up than a closure? The silence froze fans. The family didn't speak on camera. The tribute posts were sparse, cautious, almost sterile. Viewers were used to public meltdowns, emotional scream fests. This time, there was nothing but guesswork. Everything smelled like internal damage control. And here's the part nobody from production ever confirmed. Were they already prepping for the explosion before Chuck died? Because what came next wasn't just a story of grief. It was a chain reaction. Stick around, because the next turn changes how you'll look at every moment they filmed before that hospital door closed. The truth is, Chuck was never just the dad. He was the moderator, the enabler, the reluctant ringmaster in a circus run by adult children barely holding it together in front of the public eye, and barely tolerating each other behind the scenes. He wore the role like a suit he didn't ask for. TLC didn't need to script anything. They just had to turn on the cameras and let the family mess bake for 42 minutes. But what they rarely showed was why it didn't fully collapse. Chuck, who let everyone scream as long as the furniture didn't break. Chuck, who fronted the down payments, held the titles, reminded noisy kids, in private, to show up, shut up, and act like a family on camera. He was reality drama's most underrated background player. And viewers felt that. Even when the storylines focused on Libby's K1 love story with Andre or Becky's high-pitched confrontations, Chuck was the anchor. He didn't steal scenes with emotion, he anchored them with weight. The man could say 5 words and instantly shift the energy of a room packed with family hostility. But something changed. Slowly, quietly. At first, it was the strange silences during dinner scenes. A sentence left hanging midway. A confused chuckle when someone referenced a previous argument. Fans noticed online. Reddit threads lit up with side comments like, "Did Chuck look kinda off in that scene?" Or, "Was that a weird delay in his confessional?" It wasn't editing. It was early glioblastoma. The monster hiding behind fatigue, masked as aging, blamed on stress. Producers kept rolling. Crew kept adjusting mic packs. And the family? They'd been taught by production and by the past to write things off until they exploded. Chuck didn't explode. He eroded. He started arriving to shoots more tired, needing more breaks, slurring his words during pickups. The team doubled his water bottles. They made his seats more comfortable. TLC worked him gently because they knew the fights didn't hit unless Chuck was in the background, shaking his head, holding a plate of ribs. So what happens when the only person holding chaos together can't hold himself upright anymore? The short answer? The cracks widened, and everyone started moving differently. Libby, who once dominated story arcs with Andre, got quieter, less fiery, more internal. In group scenes, she wasn't the one pushing anymore. Becky started keeping tabs, allegedly asking questions behind the scenes to producers, wondering how serious her dad's health was. She suspected something before anyone said anything out loud. Charlie, meanwhile, treated every pause as a power vacuum. Anytime Chuck missed filming, it shifted everyone's performance. TLC thrives on tension, but what they don't necessarily expect is real tension. The kind that doesn't follow neat story beats, that spirals aimlessly, that doesn't look good in thumbnails. It wasn't just one family member who began to feel unstable without Chuck. It was all of them. The glue was losing its grip. And when filming resumed weeks later, Chuck back in his chair, but weaker behind the eyes, the atmosphere had changed. You could watch him smile and see the effort. Behind the screen, some producers began quietly preparing contingency plans. Things like alternate setups and 2-camera confessional builds for other family members. Nothing was said in official production meetings, but line producers allegedly whispered it, "Get backup footage just in case." Because if Chuck went down, what they had wasn't a show. It was a pile of lawsuits and emotional debt in HD. Then came the moment, tiny but unforgettable, when Chuck forgot someone's name mid-filming. A grandchild. Just a beat too long. Libby catches it, masks it with a laugh, but her eyes dart. Andre notices, he stiffens. Producers were rolling the whole time. That scene made it to air, but fans misread the awkward tension. They thought someone had a bad attitude. In reality, they were processing an invisible shift. And Chuck? He noticed too. Every mistake, every word he couldn't find. He started moving out of the shot faster. Started suggesting the others film without him. He was trying to exit on his own terms, even if his family refused to accept what they were watching in real time. Retention booster? The day Chuck stepped off set early, someone else quietly stepped in to fill the gap. And it wasn't Libby. The gloves started coming off. Internal producer notes began listing words like uncooperative, tense, and hard reset. But those notes weren't about Chuck. They were about Andre. Because with the anchor faltering, gravity started pulling in every direction. Andre filled airspace during pickups. He talked over producers' mid-takes, blamed lighting gear for shadows, blamed scripts for audience misperception. One week, he accused a camera operator of creating a false narrative with shot angles. Chuck said nothing. He sat, sipping water, slowly blank behind the eyes, half present for the only world he'd known since his family got TV famous. But the family was changing. The fights were harder. The edits were harsher. And Chuck's absence, whether physical or mental, wasn't symbolic. It was felt in blood. TLC knew this wouldn't stay behind the scenes forever. The cast could blow steam in confessionals. But the core? The key to audience sympathy? Gone. Chuck's legacy wasn't big speeches or viral moments. It was his constant presence. A man who probably didn't ask for fame, didn't chase it, but stood in the center because no one else could calm the storm. And without him? Ask yourself this. What happens when the one person who held back the collapse dies quietly off screen? You'll see the answer in the next stage. When protection turned to panic and silence turned to threat. There's a specific kind of tension that settles into a home when grief isn't processed. It festers in silence, clings to routines, and poisons everything that used to feel normal. That's what set into the Castrovet orbit during the final stretch of Chuck's illness. Not a dramatic explosion at first, but a cold vacuum. Emotionally, it was like waking up every day in a room where the windows were nailed shut. Chuck hadn't passed yet. But something else already had. The dynamic. Crew members noticed it before the camera stopped rolling. They said the family wasn't fighting correctly anymore. Not fake enough to edit, not raw enough to air. It was broken, inconsistent energy. Libby wasn't herself. Her timing was off, her phrasing foggy. Confessionals dragged. She gave first-take answers with no color, like she was scared to say what she really thought. And maybe she was. For the first time, Elizabeth Castrovet, the queen of standing her ground in some of the show's most iconic kitchen meltdowns, was shrinking. Not on screen. In between. She'd delay fittings. Skip post-scene recaps. At one point, editors complained they had too many pauses to cut around. Her solo sit-downs were missing the fire. Even her posture looked different. Slumped back, hands folded, no forward lean. Bottom line? Libby looked like she didn't want to be there anymore. But Andre did. Too much, maybe. And here's where the balance shifted. With Chuck deteriorating off-screen, Andre started filling the air he left behind. Not the role. The space. According to two crew members, Andre's energy started changing in a way that made sets uneasy. He wasn't yelling, not yet. But the hostility was rising. Passive-aggressive remarks turned into direct confrontations. He'd comment on call sheets too loudly. Question lineups in front of junior production staff. Eye roll through notes from story editors. Not loud enough to be labeled hostile, but tired enough to feel like warning signals. There was this one reshoot day. A small scene. Libby was supposed to do a quick narrative update solo. 5 crew. Light setup. Nothing serious. She walked in, saw the lights, froze for a second, then asked, "Is Andre going to be here? Did he approve this?" That's when people started asking other questions. Why was Andre involved in pre-shoot setups now? Why did Libby need his approval for a solo? And where exactly was Chuck during all this? He was still alive. But he wasn't present, not in the way production needed him. Hospital visits were increasing, calls were going unanswered. Chuck would cancel with short notice, and siblings who once bragged about being TLC staples now argued off-camera about whether filming should even continue for the season. Fans on forums thought Season 9 felt weird. They were right, but they didn't know why. The family wasn't acting different because ratings were lower. They were acting different because they were afraid of breaking down on camera. And some allegedly were. A source close to production said there were at least 3 moments during filming where Libby cried during off hours, not in interview chairs. In her car, door shut, mic still on. You won't hear that audio. It's been scrubbed, but production notes exist. That's when field logs started including personal behavior blurbs. Mood, tense. Communication, minimal. Requesting breaks, frequent. One day, Libby reportedly walked out early, muttering something about not feeling like a person anymore. Meanwhile, Andre was sarcastically critiquing a producer's scene outline in the next room. Retention booster, he didn't raise his voice that day. But half the lighting team requested reassignment after the shoot. By now, TLC had picked up on the shift. The style of documentation changed. More paper, more timestamps. Videos of rehearsals, notes on who said what between retakes. It wasn't drama capture anymore. It was liability insurance. The tension wasn't about scenes running long or cast improvising outside the script. It was about a vibe no one could name out loud. Something in the air felt charged, like everyone was waiting for someone to snap. But they didn't know who or when. Andre was pushing harder every week. Nothing too obvious, but his fuse got shorter. He'd claim the lighting made him look aggressive. Then accuse an associate producer of favoring Charlie and Becky during edits. Then raise concerns about how scenes were being manipulated to make him the villain again. One source described it like this. Putting Andre in a normal group scene was like dropping a lit match into a bucket of wine. It didn't explode. It boiled. He wanted control. TLC wanted structure. Chuck was too weak to bridge the gap. And Libby? She was caught between protecting a dying parent and protecting her place in the show. It was somewhere in those weeks that HR reportedly got involved. Not because of a single incident, but because the volume of unusual behavior was stacking fast. People weren't filing complaints yet, but they were typing things out. Off-mic aggression, crew isolation, emotional fatigue. And that raises the big unanswered question. Did Chuck's death fracture more than just the family's emotions? Did it collapse the entire production's stability? Some believe it started the chain. Others feel the cracks were already there, and Chuck holding on for so long only delayed the fallout. But there's no debate about what happened next. Because when Chuck finally passed, and grief became the official headline, everything that was quiet got loud. The meltdowns, the fights, the walkouts. Suddenly, it wasn't just about managing their storyline. It was about protecting the crew. And production hadn't even seen the worst of it yet. Stick around, because the next shift didn't end with discomfort. It ended with someone getting physically removed from a set. And what he said on the way out changed the entire direction of the franchise. The cameras weren't rolling when the big one hit. Not the wide-angle confessionals, not the dinner table brawls edited to fit the runtime. The scene that finally imploded this franchise wasn't organized, wasn't blocked, and wasn't supposed to happen. But it did. And half the crew says they'll never forget where they were standing when the yelling started. Here's what TLC hoped you'd never piece together. By the time the final fight shut down the season, things had already been unraveling fast behind the scenes. Entire shooting days were getting thrown out because of walk-offs. Editors were begging for normal scenes. Even B-roll was stressful. Nothing felt usable anymore. And in private, production leads were whispering something they'd never said during a 90-day shoot. This might not be recoverable. Andre's fights weren't cinematic anymore. They were unpredictable. Below the surface, they'd been building over weeks. He had barked at assistant producers, turned down rewrites during shoot windows, refused pickups unless his version of the scene was used. Sounds like a diva move? It wasn't. It was tactical. He didn't trust the show anymore. And Elizabeth? She wasn't even trying to act neutral. Her presence in the car had changed. Normally reserved time for a decompressing between scenes had turned into emotional fallout. 2 different crew members said they noted her staying 30 minutes extra inside her car some days. Engine off, phone down, eyes forward, and that's when HR formally intervened. Not out of compassion, out of concern. According to insider memos, TLC's field producers filed enough reports in a 2-week window to raise contract flags. They weren't writing down on-set messiness. They were documenting fear, anxiety meds, unpredictability, emotional harm. At least one coordinator claimed they'd stopped bringing junior crew on set with Andre since January. Then came the last straw. The crew was shooting a group night scene. On schedule, but under pressure. It was a wrap dinner sequence meant to tie up loose ends before heading into tell-all prep. Multiple casts were invited. Stakes were low, or so they thought. Andre arrived irritated. One audio tech had trouble miking him. He tossed the lav pack onto a table and accused him of tampering with his audio levels. First time? Nope. That incident had been flagged twice before. This time, it cracked. Andre allegedly muttered under his breath that the crew was sabotaging him. A field producer walked over, calmly tried to reset expectations. Boom. That's when informants say Andre got in his face. Literally. We're talking inches away. Elevated chest, voice sharp. Elizabeth steps in. She tries to de-escalate, putting a hand on his shoulder. He brushes her off. Not violently, but visibly. Retention booster. A boom mic was hot while this happened, and it picked up something that made producers jump in real time. It wasn't screaming. It was calm. It was Andre clearly saying, "You're framing me to destroy the season. I see it. And I'm not playing that game anymore." Multiple staff froze. Cameras weren't running, but someone flipped an emergency cam on. Team protocol for volatile incidents not scripted. Footage exists, but it's buried. Security was called in. For the first time in this series, they didn't escort cast out discreetly. They blocked filming, cleared the room. Elizabeth started crying. Quietly, no dramatics, no slammed doors. She turned to the field producer and said this exactly, allegedly, "I told you this was going to happen." By the next morning, emails were flying. Management called an emergency meeting. Legal was looped in. They reviewed previous complaints, technician notes, eyewitness statements. They even pulled raw dump footage, unedited reels from previous weeks, to look for escalation. What they built wasn't drama, it was a case file. And when executives watched the sequence and the clips that led up to it, one of them reportedly said, "This isn't content anymore, it's exposure." At that point, it wasn't about saving the season. It was about ending it quietly enough to avoid headlines. Because if a crew member leaves set shaking and multiple departments report altered behavior from a lead personality, TLC doesn't write a new scene. They remove the person. So why not release a statement? Why not make the exit clear? Because admitting what happened out loud would have changed how viewers saw every previous season. This was no longer reality TV chaos. This was risk management. And it started before Chuck died, but got worse every day after, because Chuck could manage heat. He'd been through years of family-triggered production stress, but without him, the production team no longer had a buffer, or a conscience, sitting in the middle of the storm. Andre wasn't the only problem, just the loudest one. Elizabeth, torn between love and loyalty, couldn't defuse him anymore. Her presence started to look less like support and more like codependency. Entire days of footage were trashed, test interviews were cut, editing teams began having mental health breaks built into their schedules because of the emotional load of watching it all. They thought they were wrapping a season. What they were doing was quarantining a PR nightmare inside a hard drive. And that's why TLC didn't announce anything. No goodbyes. No tribute episode, no final scene to leak to tabloids. It wasn't branding, it wasn't cancellation, it was a quiet erasure. They ghosted one of the franchise's longest stories by flipping a switch and pretending they were never there. But what happened next? The internal memo, the blacklist, and the crew notes that defined careers is exactly what we're breaking next. And it gets darker. By the time the executive producers watched the footage, there was no debate left. They weren't watching a reality show anymore. They were watching a liability. That morning, a senior post-production supervisor dropped a composite cut into the internal server. 23 minutes of raw, unfiltered moments stitched from over a month's worth of buried chaos. No music, no edits, no producer interjections. It was a private reel not meant for broadcast. It started with a handheld shot of Andre pacing off camera after a group dinner. He wasn't in costume. He was half-mic'd. You could hear him asking why the storyline made him look unstable. The mic popped twice, likely from the gain clipping. Then a shot of him slamming a chair against the wall. No damage, but the sound turned everyone's head. Cut to Libby sobbing behind a production trailer. Muffled, but the words, "I can't do this," were clear enough. That wasn't a breakdown for storyline. That was someone realizing the machine they helped build no longer had brakes. "Are we still filming a show?" one exec said during the virtual meeting. "Or are we documenting someone losing control?" This was it. The moment they realized everything had gone too far. Andre and Elizabeth weren't being suspended, reworked, or rotated out. They were being ghosted, permanently. Because every minute of that footage reinforced one thing. The final fight wasn't the issue. It was the consequence. Incident reports had been climbing steadily for months. One from a sound technician described Andre allegedly accusing him of spying through audio packs. A lighting assistant logged an event where Andre reportedly advanced during a location argument, arms stiff, eyes locked, enough for her to step back behind a crew truck to radio security. 4 field producers, 2 audio engineers, 1 producer's assistant who decided to quit altogether. That's the body count of sabotage this storyline had created before production made the call. Retention booster, Andre was the first cast member in franchise history to trigger an emergency legal review before a season had even wrapped. And if that wasn't enough, this was the real shocker. They didn't just discuss removing him. They considered pulling every piece of promo with the Castrovet name. Because somewhere between Chuck's last breath and Andre's last mic toss, the narrative had gone nuclear. And TLC, the guilt factory of chaotic marriages and passport drama, had finally crossed a line where ratings weren't worth the lawsuit. Here's how it laid out logistically. The HR file was over 40 pages. It included a direct complaint citing a hostile work environment sustained across 5 weeks. Video with crew visibly flinching. Audio where Elizabeth breaks down saying she felt trapped. Mic logs where Andre questions if producers deliberately chose story beats to destroy him. Then there was the Zoom meeting. Multiple senior executive producers, programming directors, and legal counsel sat in. One of the original 90-day flagship producers said, "They've given us some of our best drama, but this isn't television. This is trauma." Others tried to push back. The numbers are still strong. But the post-production log spoke louder. Out of 68 hours of captured footage in the final quarter of shooting, less than 12 hours could be ethically edited for use. Not because of censorship, but because too much real damage bled through. Andre wasn't improvising tension anymore. He was reportedly spiraling. And Libby? She was emotionally AWOL, sometimes showing up, sometimes asking to leave early, sometimes sitting in a makeup chair with her eyes locked somewhere out the window while production stalled. So why didn't they air it raw? Let the story end the way it was heading? Because accelerating disaster isn't the same as documenting it. Not when the people behind the lens are traumatized. Not when staff is asking for backup. That's the line TLC finally decided it couldn't tiptoe anymore. The call was made. No press release, no final interview. They triggered the NDA wipe. All remaining scheduled appearances for the Castrovets were dropped without confirmation. The tell-all was edited to leapfrog their story entirely. Every trace of their final arc was quietly pulled from press packets. Promo shots replaced. No goodbye, no teaser, no closure. Inside TLC, it was called the cold exit. So was this really the first time a cast member was banned mid-season? Yes, without question. And it had nothing to do with on-screen behavior. It had everything to do with the body language you were never allowed to see. And now, the legacy of the Castrovet family, the boat rides, the brawls, the backyard BBQs, the tears, the Moldova wedding, that legacy is shelved. Not erased, but locked. Their tapes are still legally archived. Their footage still stored. But access? Restricted. Because TLC isn't just a drama factory now. It's a cleanup crew. One source close to a showrunner quietly confirmed Andre and Elizabeth's ban wasn't for a single outburst. It was for the pattern. They stopped being cast, he said. They became a threat to the crew, the production structure, and the franchise's sanity. No one was safe filming with them, mentally or professionally. Which leaves one final question. What happens to a reality TV couple when the reality becomes too dangerous to show? That answer's coming next. And trust me, the blacklist wasn't even the end of this fallout. There's still one final decision TLC made that fans never got to vote on. And it involves a producer who left the industry altogether. Here's what no one tells you about being a reality TV cast member. There's no off switch, no quiet moment, no place to fully break down without someone waiting for the shot. That was Elizabeth Castrovet's reality in her final weeks on set. A woman split into one part grieving daughter, one part trapped spouse, and every part exhausted by a spotlight she no longer controlled. Chuck was gone. The man who held their family together wasn't just missing from the dinner table, he was missing from the emotional infrastructure. And for someone like Libby, who'd spent a decade learning how to perform pain on camera, this wasn't the kind she could fake. She stopped smiling between retakes, stopped pitching fun scenes to producers. At one point, she stopped taking their calls entirely. Everything felt performative, except what she actually felt. And the worst part? She was still trying to save the story. After production flagged Andre for the final time and shut down their segment, Elizabeth sent what insiders describe as a midnight email to one of the executive producers. It wasn't a power play. It wasn't even a defense. It was a plea. In that email, never made public but confirmed through multiple sources, Libby asked for a call. Not to demand being kept on the show, but to ask, is there anything I can do to keep this from ending this way? No lawyers. No threats. No PR spin. Just a daughter who lost her dad and was about to lose the only platform telling her version of that loss. That message was never answered. Because by then, the decision had already been made. At the highest level, TLC wasn't just cutting them, they were cutting access. That's why you didn't hear her story, not the real one. What made it to Instagram was filtered. What happened alone in her car at 11 a.m. between scenes was not. Retention booster? One crew member said a hot mic once picked up Libby whispering, "Does this still matter if no one's listening?" You've seen Elizabeth argue. Seen her push back on Becky, on Charlie, even push Andre when cameras were rolling. But in those last moments, when she knew the network had turned cold, her energy flipped. It wasn't silence for effect, it was surrender. Production noticed. Footage of her arriving late, eyes swollen, no foundation over the red marks under her lashes. Makeup artists noted the texture of her skin changing, signs of lack of sleep, dehydration, stress migraines. She didn't try to hide it. What would be the point? With Chuck gone, her grief wasn't pretty. And with production ghosting them, she realized something viewers hadn't. She wasn't just losing a spot on a show. She was losing the only version of her family history made visible to the world. And Andre? He wasn't emailing quietly. He went the other way. Hard. Allegedly, he accused a co-producer of orchestrating a staged takedown in one message. Asked who controlled the edit. Demanded TLC release the real footage. He doubled down, not softened up. That aggression, that refusal to read the room, even in the middle of his wife's most vulnerable season, reportedly sealed it. That final digital outburst was logged as the last strike. One insider said, if she'd come alone or Karen-style defended herself only, there might have been some kind of future. But it wasn't just about solo behavior anymore. It was the combo. By that point, even on-set allies, makeup artists, wardrobe consultants, PAs who once adored working with Libby were pulling back. Too much tension, too many days where TLC's top priority was no longer content. It was containment, and Libby knew it. She started pulling away from press. No more tagged reunions, no sneak peeks, no teasers, no fan Q&As. Her Instagram turned quieter, posts more curated, less grounded. Once quick to respond to rumors online, she now watched them pass in silence. The comments got meaner. The fans noticed her absence, but didn't understand that silence sometimes isn't protection. It's punishment. The camera had turned off, but the judgment kept rolling. Because here's what fans missed in real time. Grief doesn't care how famous you were. Grief doesn't care if there's a crew waiting for lighting setup. Grief shows up whether you're camera ready or not. And when Andre kept pushing with louder accusations, more sarcastic threats, and one last bitter, silence-breaking message to TLC branded as devastating by a senior field editor, everything changed. No more Hail Marys. The silence became strategy. Libby never got her call back. That last message to production was her final on-the-record attempt to explain her side. And when no one responded, something shifted in her body language. She didn't yell. She didn't chase. She just stopped showing up. Even fans, who had watched her for years, started asking why she had become flat, thinking it was story boredom. Not realizing we were watching someone grieve the death of her father and her public identity on the same timeline. Chuck left a hole. TLC filled it with paperwork. Libby left quietly. TLC made sure it stayed that way. And while the public wondered if the Castrovets were over the drama, something was bubbling quietly in the background because the final hit came not from a producer, but from the network itself. And it involved a contract clause no one ever thought TLC would activate. They were there on Monday, gone by Friday. Not fired on air, not canceled, not explained. Just erased. No send-off, no exit drama, no final confessionals. For a franchise that had documented messy divorces, immigration fraud, family fistfights, and international scandals, what TLC did next with Andre and Elizabeth was quietly unprecedented. They deleted them. And not with red tape or public outrage, with silence. It started behind closed doors. Internally, they called it a soft blackout. The directive was passed quickly. Pull all future promo featuring the Castrovets. Strip their episode teasers. Remove their press mentions from cast media kits. Reroute fan pages away from their segment links. Executives were clear, no acknowledgement. The mistake wasn't that they had ever been on television. The mistake, in TLC's eyes, would be giving any more attention to how it ended. So everything they'd filmed after Chuck's passing, every scene, every word, was shelved like contaminated footage. No premieres, no leaks, no send-off montage with sad music and throwback clips. When fans noticed, they assumed they'd simply moved on. TLC didn't correct them. And that was the point. It wasn't damage control. It was surgery. Retention booster. One TLC editor allegedly called it the hardest wipe they've ever done behind the scenes, because the footage was too good to scrap, but too risky to ever air. Meanwhile, the emotional damage inside the crew didn't disappear. Makeup artists who'd worked with Libby for years asked to be reassigned to spin-off crews. At least 2 PAs reportedly requested final pay settlements with NDA extensions, not because of public risk, but because reliving the material during post-production made them physically sick. We're not talking about workplace drama. We're talking about people who had spent years normalizing dysfunction, finally realizing this time was different. Internal memos revealed team members citing unresolved trauma, unsafe field conditions, and psychological fatigue directly related to the final weeks of production with Andre and Elizabeth. These weren't fans cracking Reddit theories. These were staff who'd put in emotional labor for seasons and reached a breaking point. That's when TLC's legal panel quietly activated a contract clause nicknamed Mutual Silence. It's buried deep in the original standard talent agreement, allowing for a full on-camera blackout of a cast member and their related material without cause. No lawsuit, no public shaming, just a legal disappearance. And that was it. The Castrovettes were effectively locked out of the entire 90-day universe. No pillow talk invitations, no happily ever after second try. Not even reunion montages. Gone. The messy story that fed seasons of viewership was quietly flame retarded before it could ignite again. And fans never got closure. Because closure requires narrative, and narrative requires ownership. But TLC couldn't own what happened. Not publicly. Not when it involved breakdowns, staff asking for anxiety meds before call time, and footage that, if leaked, might shift public sympathy in unpredictable directions. So instead of explaining, they removed the context, replaced the trail of emotion with brushstrokes of creative changes, paid influencers to pivot toward newer couples, baited attention toward scandalous newcomers, let fans guess, let them theorize. It worked. Mostly, a few hardcore viewers still ask why the Castrovettes weren't at the tell-all, or why their footage felt scattered. But the rest moved on. And that's what TLC was counting on. Truth is, the network learned something. Not about better cast screening or healthier filming practices, but about how valuable silence can be when you control an entire ecosystem of storytelling. One former producer admitted, the audience will forgive freakouts. What they won't forgive is feeling played. So we erase before they get the chance. And here's where it gets wild. Other cast members noticed. They saw what happened and how fast it unfolded, heard how legal swept in, saw how one wrong scene could trigger a blacklist with no refunds, no recaps, no second chances. And for producers, that wasn't a tragedy. It was a blueprint. Create chaos. Monetize it as conflict. And when the fire starts burning down the set, pour water silently and keep filming somewhere else. Meanwhile, the very couple who once carried entire specials on their backs is now treated as if they never existed. Elizabeth's wedding, Andre's green card panic, Chuck's tears during family BBQs, all immortalized in reruns, but without any acknowledgement that the story had a violent, painful, and deeply human ending. And that's the cruel irony. The people who built a brand off showing everything chose to show nothing when things got real. Not because they couldn't, because they were afraid that this time the audience wouldn't take the network's side. And what's still coming? The secret fallout that didn't hit the headlines, but broke apart a production department, triggered a casting overhaul, and sparked anonymous staff leaks that finally reached the press. That's next. And trust me, if you think TLC was done scrubbing the past, there's one scene they've been trying to bury for good.